Buddhist philosophy speaks of the four invisibles: water to the fish, air to the bird, mind to mankind, and enlightenment to the ignorant. Because you see, you never know your own element. Now, it's impossible, therefore, to give a definition of consciousness, because we don't know anything outside it, just as the fish doesn't know anything outside water, and the bird doesn't know anything outside air. We don't know unconsciousness. We only know when we have been unconscious. And so we are in a very difficult fix to attempt to define the subject of this seminar. We all know what it is, and yet none of us know what it is. We know we're conscious. It's the same sort of problem as to try to say what color your eyes are. I don't mean whether they're blue or brown, but the color of the iris, the lens of the eye. Because we say it has no color, it's transparent, it's like pure glass. And yet, that might be a color to somebody who had a different kind of eye. An Englishman and a Hindu were once sitting in the backyard of the Hindu's home, and the Hindu was talking about the necessity of a background for the perception of any figure. So he said, against what background do you see those flowers? And he said, against the background of the hedge. And against what background do you see the hedge? He said, the background of the hills. And against what background do you see the hills? He said, the background of the sky. And he said, and against what background do you see the sky? And the Englishman fell silent. The Hindu said, it's the background of consciousness. But there you see we reach a limit. And you can talk until all is blue about whether consciousness and reality are the same thing, whether there really is ever any such thing as pure unconsciousness, whether consciousness is eternal, whether, as the subjective idealists would say in philosophy, there is primarily mind, and all so-called physical and material existence is something in mind or something in consciousness. You can debate that subject forever and ever and ever and come out nowhere. There is no answer to the question when asked in that way. But it is helpful as a start to make things at once more simple and perhaps a little more difficult by overcoming at the beginning the traditional opposition between the spiritual and the material, or the mental and the material. By the trick of talking about all things, whether spiritual or physical, in terms of pattern. Because that's all anybody can really talk about. Pattern. You see, it's fundamental to our common sense, which was highly influenced by Aristotle in the book of Genesis, that all forms are composed of some substance, in roughly the same way as sculptures are made of stone, or pots made of clay. But a serious physicist no longer thinks in such terms about the material world. He doesn't think it's made of anything, because what the physical process of nature is patterns. You could say patterns of energy, but that's using the old ceramic language. Patterns aren't made of energy. The patterning is the same thing as the energy. So if you use the verb patterning as what the universe is, then you get something that you can talk about. You can describe patterns, you can measure them. you can say what a pattern is doing, although a pattern isn't a thing. A pattern is a verb, it is a process, it's an activity. So we can say patterning is what is going on. And consciousness is a kind of patterning, as we shall see. Just so are flowers and human beings and stars, and trees, water, air, everything, even space itself, is a form of patterning. And this means, in other words, that the universe is what physicists would call an energy field. And likewise, consciousness is a field. In the sense, say, that space is obviously a field. That is to say, an area in which things happen. That's the primary meaning of field. A field is a playing field, a field in which something happens, like an arena. Only when you use the word field more in the sense of physics, you mean a field of forces, like a magnetic field, like a gravitational field. And the curious thing about fields is that they exercise their energy in a non-mechanical way. For example, if gravity were non-field, that is to say, if it were the ordinary sort of exercise of energy, like the propagation of heat, or like someone pulling, then when you put something on the ground, you put a good heavy lead plate on the ground, that would be absorbing so much gravitational energy, and therefore anything you put on top of the plate would be less acted upon by gravity than the lead plate itself, and then anything on top of that would be still less, and you would reduce the energy of gravity by piling things up. But you don't. It doesn't make the slightest difference to the gravitational field. So in the same way, if you take an electrical coil, say surrounding a plastic tube, you can put a current through that, and you create a field within the tube. You can put your hand inside the tube and nothing will happen to it. But the minute you put something that is like steel inside the tube, it will get hot. But no heat will be generated until the steel is inside the tube, because the coil plus the steel equals heat. But the coil has to polarize with the steel inside before anything happens at all. So that shows us that what is operating is a field. Now, think then of the world as a field characterized by patterning, for which another name is energy. And we are going to have to treat consciousness in rather the same way. Now, one thing that is characteristic of all energies whatsoever, all patterning whatsoever, is that we find it convenient to think about it in terms of the spectrum. So there is a spectrum of light, the visible spectrum running from red to violet, and beyond the visible spectrum there is a very big invisible spectrum, because our eyes respond only to a small section of the measurable spectrum of light. So we have infrared rays at one end and ultraviolet at the other, and then so on out to cosmic rays, gamma rays, hard X-rays, all sorts of things on the invisible bands of the spectrum. So in exactly the same way, there is a spectrum of sound. And if anybody was a sufficient scientist of cookery, they would devise a spectrum of taste. There are certainly spectra of other kinds of vibration than sound and light. And there are likewise conceivable spectra of shapes, spectra of emotions. So we could talk too of a spectrum of love, ranging at the red end from lust or the Freudian libido to divine love at the violet end, divine charity. And in the middle greens would be things like friendship and endearment, and so on. Each emotion, as a matter of fact, could be thought of as having its own spectrum. Now then, the curious thing about the world is that it's a kind of interlocking of spectra, of which the best analogy would be weaving. The interesting thing about weaving is that you've got the two groups of cross threads which give you the pattern, the warp and the woof. And if you pull out either one, there is no pattern, nor is there any cloth. It all falls apart. It needs both the warp and the woof for there to be any pattern at all. And they together constitute the cloth. Now let's look at a similar illustration in the ordinary everyday world of this interlocking of patterns. Let's take the photograph of a face in a newspaper. If you examine this photograph under a magnifying glass, or even with the naked eye, you will easily see that it isn't a continuous face, as faces are supposed to be, but it is a whole collection of dots. Some are heavy, some are light. And according to the heaviness and lightness, as you stand back, you get, as it were, the illusion of there being present, in terms of those dots, a human face. Now let me pose the question. What is the relationship between the form of the face and the gridwork of dots? At first sight, there doesn't seem to be any relationship between them at all, because the printer uses exactly the same kind of screen with which this process is done for any face whatsoever. So the kind of screen he uses makes no difference at all to whose face it is. Anybody's face can be on it, or any other shape. So you might say the fact that he is using a grid is completely irrelevant to the form of the face. Take still another illustration, the radio. When you turn on your radio and it comes on first thing in the morning, the announcer does not say, "The sounds you are now hearing are vibrations of a diaphragm activated by electromagnetism. This is mediated to you through a network of transistors and broadcasting station with such and such features." He just does not intrude the mechanics of radio. He comes right on saying, "This is station so-and-so, welcome, this is this morning's news," or whatever he begins with. So it would seem that the structure of the radio, the wiring, the transistors, the speaker, have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the message that's coming across it. They are in two different worlds altogether, so it would seem. Then take another possibility. What about the brain? Is thought, emotion, or consciousness itself a function of the brain? If we knew a great deal about the anatomy of the brain, would that tell us a great deal about the patterns of human thinking? Or would it tell us as little about the patterns of human thinking as knowledge of radio engineering tells you about the technique of Bach, whom you hear over the radio? See, there's a real puzzle. And this is one of the interesting subjects brought out in this extraordinary book called Understanding Media by Marshall McLuhan. And I don't think he's clearly answered it, because he is trying to say that what is most important is not so much the message or what is supposed to be the content of any method of extending our nervous system, such as radio, such as television, such as printing, such as photography. He is trying to say that the message is the medium. That is to say, you are influenced by television, not so much by the advertising and all the goop that comes across on it, but by the fact of being in touch with the world through this particular electronic system with all its peculiarities. It's a very interesting idea, and he's put up an argument for it, but I'm I'm not convinced that his argument is quite solid. But I want to go into this question, because obviously you would not hear any music except you had an orchestra in your room, were it not for your radio or your phonograph. And as a matter of fact, even if you had an orchestra in your room, you wouldn't get them to produce any music without those instruments. Now, let me ask the question in another way. What is the relationship between the piano and what you play on it? Any? You can play anything practically on a piano. And the structure of the piano doesn't make any difference. And yet without it you couldn't play. So we've never seen anybody thinking without a brain. So what is the relationship between them? Well, again, you see, it's rather like warp and woof. The warp goes one way, and the woof goes the other. But by the interlocking of the two, you get something. So what you've got then are spectra of different kinds. See, when you dial, and you move the dial, what you're doing is you're changing the wavelength of your radio. That is to say, you are moving from one end of the spectrum of waves slowly to the other. So the spectrum of radio meshes with another spectrum which is being used in the production of music. As a matter of fact, the production of music is an interlocking of many spectra, but we won't go into that because the emotional spectra are involved. Spectra of speed, of dexterity, of harmonics, all kinds of things go into this. So you get the picture of the world as an enormous web, where spectra mesh with spectra of all kinds, and they're all mutually interdependent. And through them it all hangs together. And the peculiar fact of these spectra is that they come into being together almost. The world is not, you don't see things appearing in nature, except with certain insects and birds that actually practice weaving. But you don't see plants and trees being exactly woven. What seems to happen more than that is that warp and woof come into being together at the same time, in rather the same way that back and front necessarily come into being together at the same time. Or head and tail. You don't see a creature born as a head and then later developing a neck, a trunk, feet, and tail. It just doesn't work that way. It comes in together, head and tail. Even the spermatozoon has a head and a tail. So then, what I want to go into, of course, is the spectrum of consciousness and its many transformations. The huge range of this spectrum is extraordinarily fascinating. So then, but let me first be sure that we are quite clear about this physical conception of the world. You see, you can also call these spectra, if you want to, dimensions. And dimensions is a very useful idea. You can see that you can't have a physical existence in terms of point, line, surface. Each of those is a dimension. It's not till you get the so-called third dimension, although it should correctly be called the fourth, and time the fifth. It's not till you get the so-called third dimension that anything is physically manifested. Then you're there. Now you could say these dimensions are quite different from each other. A surface is a very different thing from a line, as is a line from a point. But somehow they all go with each other in a way that we don't normally think of as a kind of, in other words, dimensions don't seem to bear the same sort of relationship to each other as do opposites. At least not in our ordinary thinking. We think that opposites are mutually exclusive, and that you can't have something that is hot and cold at the same time. It's either hot or cold. But dimensions are not mutually exclusive. Dimensions are always dimensions of the same field or the same thing. And so then you have to think, therefore, of what we've hitherto called the mental and the physical, the spiritual and the material, as dimensions of the same thing. Dimensions of patterning, dimensions of energy. So then you've got this fantastic universe with all these interlocking spectra and dimensions. And this, of course, is the real harp that the angels play. When they talk about you going to heaven and playing the harp, what are you doing? You've got a spectrum of strings, see? And from that, when you play the harp, you don't play all the strings at once. But that'd be just chaos, like when you play the piano. Just don't take your elbows like this and slam the whole thing down. You select. So throughout nature, all these spectra that are interlocked are being selected from. That is why the eyes select only a narrow band of the spectrum of light, while the ears select a narrow band only of the spectrum of sound. And further than that, by the use of attention, we screen out all sorts of things we don't want to notice. Our senses are further selective, you see, influenced by thought. And so this is analogous to plucking the strings of a harp, where you make choices as to which strings you will pluck. So when the angels play their harp, the music is everything you see. So that's the real meaning of what you do in heaven when you go and play the harp. You become one with God when you create the universe, you see. That's the real meaning. Well, now, what about the spectrum of consciousness? I'm going to designate, I couldn't avoid it. I tried to, but I couldn't. A sevenfold spectrum. That's number 7 is awkward. Every kind of phony occultist is hung up on 7, and I wanted to get away from that, but I just somehow couldn't manage it. So, let's take it like this. We're going, you see, from one end, the most dull dimension of consciousness, or band of consciousness, and landing up at the other end of the brightest. So you begin with number 1, which is sleep. And of course there are 2 kinds of sleep. Dreamless and dreaming. Number 2 is torpor. As in the state of going to sleep or under the influence of alcohol, you feel no pain at all, or you're sort of anesthetized and your senses are dull and blurred, and you don't feel like being very active. 3, waking consciousness. Only I have to qualify this because the others are awake too. But I mean our normal, everyday consciousness, which we're going to call symbolic. And I'll explain why as we go through these in detail. Number 4 Sensory consciousness. Number 5, cellular. Number 6, molecular. And number 7, we'll just give the name light to it. Now, I want to make it perfectly clear that these names that I have used are not claiming to be exact scientific names. They are simply suggestive. We do not yet have a science of consciousness in the sense, the Western sense of science. It doesn't exist. And that's one of the things we shall eventually have to do. So these names are rather symbolic names than exactly scientific names, and you must keep that in mind. Now, it's rather interesting that this particular spectrum should best be drawn not on the usual way a spectrum is drawn, which is simply a band, but it should be drawn as a circle, of which each of these is, as it were, a cut in the pie. So that beyond here is again sleep. Deep sleep, dreamless sleep. Because you know the Hindus have a way of classifying the states of consciousness, which isn't quite the same as this. They start out with number 1, this one, the waking state. Then they take number 2, the dreaming state. Number 3, the dreamless state. And number 4, this one, which is called Turiya simply, which means the fourth, and which cannot be described. And they would say that when you go to bed at night, you sink first into the dreaming state, then you go down into what they call sushupti, the dreamless state, and you may get back into the fourth, and that is why sleep refreshes you. Because you as an individual are withdrawn into the center of the universe, into the Atman, or the Brahman, the primordial reality, the ground of being, to use Tillich's phrase, which he got from Jakob Böhme. And so that's why you are refreshed every night. That's there you know who you are, really, deep in. Because, as the Hindus teach, everybody is really it. That is to say, the Godhead. Playing at being, dreaming at being, whoever is your particular personality. And then it's only at night, then, when you sleep, that you go back again to being the undivided, one and only single essence of the universe. Only when you wake up, you forget about it. Why? Because in the primordial state, there's nothing to remember. There's no time. And you have to have time working for memory to work. So imagine then this thing as a circle, where, say, at the top of the circle you have number 7. Brilliant. And then the colors of consciousness going right round and meeting again here. Here and here. So you kind of have black and white next to each other at the top. If we'll put this in terms of color. And then all the other colors connecting them all the way around. Because, of course, you see, black and white, as I will show you later on in the seminar, are astonishingly creative. You can do everything with black and white. Black and white really contain all color. And this is why the Chinese theory of the universe is based on the opposition of the yang and the yin, the positive and negative. The names yang and yin are derived respectively from the north and the south sides of a mountain. This is the primordial image. The yang is the south side of the mountain, which is bright. The yin is the north side of the mountain, which is in the shadow. Now, nobody ever saw a one-sided mountain. Can't be such a thing. So in the same way, you cannot have yang without yin. The symbol of the yang-yin, you know well, I don't even need to draw it. The two interlocked commas, one black, one white, and each with the opposite color as its eye, so that they look like two fishes chasing each other. This is a very profound symbol, because the idea which goes with it is this, that yang and yin are a wave process, where the yin aspect is the crest and the yang aspect is the trough. And likewise, in the same way as you can't have a one-sided hill, you can't have half a wave. Half a wave doesn't exist anywhere in nature. There are no half waves of light, no half waves of sound. There are always complete waves, or none. Because you cannot have the crest without the trough, and you can't have the trough without the crest. It just won't work. Now, however, there is a pulse in this. There is a point where the yang force reaches an ascendancy and then begins to drop into the yin, where the yin force reaches an ascendancy and begins to rise into the yang. And the Chinese are always thinking about this in relation to tendencies in natural and human affairs, where, for example, the yang force of a storm will reach a peak point where it must drop over into the yin force of calm. Where the whole book of changes, they call the Yi Jing, is based on this. The Yi Jing is a marvelous play with yang and yin. You see, just let me say this about it in parenthesis. When you want to make a decision, and you've got all the facts in, at least all the facts you've got time to collect, because you could go on collecting facts about any decision forever, but the time comes when you have to make it. And you say, now I've got all the facts, and they really don't help me to decide, because I might go one way and I might go the other. Let's flip a coin. And everybody's always doing that. But you see, a coin only gives you two possibilities. Two answers. Either the thing answers yes or no. So the Chinese have a coin, as it were, to flip, which gives you 64 possibilities. And you take one of them. And it doesn't give you a yes or no answer. It gives you a kind of a thing like a Rorschach blot, really. It doesn't look like a Rorschach blot, but that's what it is. Into which you read your situation and make up your mind accordingly. And this is done, you see, by combining the yang and the yin in a complex pattern. The I Ching consists of hexagrams. And they're composed of two kinds of lines. An unbroken line, like this, is a yang or positive line. And a broken line, like this, is a yin or negative line. Then, there you've got them. Now, there are, if you take a figure with three lines, which we'll call a trigram, see? There are 8 ways of making such a trigram with yang and yin lines. This one happens to mean fire. No, water. No, fire, excuse me. Fire. 2 positive and 1 negative in the middle. Now, if you've got 8 trigrams, there's a possibility of making out of those 8 trigrams 64 hexagrams. So this one would be water, and you'd get one which was fire and water together. See? So to each of those, the Book of Changes attaches an oracular remark. And if you look up the book, when you've, by a certain process, got your hexagram, it gives you some light on your decision and the direction it should take by bringing it out of you by its remarks, in the same way as a Rorschach blot brings out your psychological disposition. So that's 64 ways of tossing a coin. If you had a 64-sided coin, you could do it that way. If you could make such a thing, you probably could. It'd be spherical. So, from yang and yin, from the extremes of polarity, because you see, light is as intensely alive as you can get. But if you go too far into light, it'll burn you up, and you'll get darkness. The people don't know, they don't realize that the farthest you can get into darkness, it'll start getting bright. Because you can't have darkness without light any more than you can have light without darkness. So when we were babies, we were never told this. And it's the secret that light and dark go together. It is the only real secret there is. Black and white. But what we've forgotten the secret, because with black and white we're playing another game, which is called, black might win. See, that's what makes everything a thrill. If you knew you would always win in any situation, it would be just a pushover, and life would suddenly cease to have any interest whatsoever. You would be, imagine yourselves in total control of everything that happens, a kind of Jehovah type. You would be bored to death. Everything would do just what, no surprises, nothing. You see, when in a game, you're playing a game, and the outcome of the game becomes known. Supposing in the course of bridge, the 4 players all suddenly realize together that one of them has all the cards that will take the tricks. What do? They don't play the game, they cancel it and begin again, shuffle the pack. When in chess, 2 pundits are sitting there meditating, one of them suddenly says, well, it's obvious, in 53 moves you're going to win. They cancel the game. So in the same way, an omniscient God who knew the whole future would cancel the universe and say, think up another. So it is fundamental to the game of black and white that it must seem that black will win and eat up white. That, in other words, non-existence will triumph over existence. Or rather, let me put it this way, non-being will triumph over being. Because the secret is that existence is being and non-being, oscillating. So that for every time you get being, you get non-being. Just as everything is vibration. And these spectra are vibrations. Light is vibration. If I sit next to a girl at the movies and I want to make flirtations with her, and I put my hand on her knee, and I leave it there, she'll cease to notice it. But if I gently pat her knee, she'll know I'm there all the time, because I go on and off, on and off, on and off, on and off, on and off. And that is energy, you see. That's something happening. And so everything is on-off. Only sometimes on-off happens so fast that you don't notice the off. For example, light is a pulsation, but all light seems to be constant. And so we don't notice the off because our retina is retaining the image of on while the off is happening in the light. So we don't notice the off, except if you get an arc light. You can notice a little flicker to it. And that's why they don't allow arc lights in sawmills. Because sometimes the flickering of the arc light can synchronize with the movement of the teeth on the saw in such a way that the saw seems to be still when it's actually moving, and people get very serious accidents that way. But everything is on-off. Now then, sometimes, you see, we don't notice the off, but at other times we don't notice the on. And that is when we're asleep, when, in other words, or when we're dead, when the trough, the off section, takes a long spin. Because you see, there are big vibrations and little vibrations. Some vibrations happen so fast that we can't measure them. Others happen so slowly that it takes a century. It may take 1,000,000 years for a single swoop of the curve that goes down or that makes the upcrest of the wave. You see, when you look at the wave pattern, you must realize that the crest is measured from the top to the middle of each trough, and that the trough is measured from the top of each crest to the bottom of the trough. They overlap. So if you can argue it's all trough, and you can argue it's all crest, it's a funny world. So the argument that it's all trough, and that maybe just a little bit of crest, about poing, like that, poing. These are the people who say, well, we are flashes in an eternal darkness. It's a pessimistic point of view. And then there are the people who say there really is no death at all. Death is just an illusion that seems to happen. This is the optimistic point of view. And the optimistic point of view is essential to the pessimistic, as the pessimistic is essential to the optimistic. Because you wouldn't know who you were, you see, if you didn't have both points of view. I'm not going to see, and when I teach, I don't try to persuade anybody. And everybody's at liberty to disagree, because I wouldn't know what I was thinking unless there were people to disagree with me. So in the same way, supposing you're in a social scene, like here in La Jolla, there are nice people, and there are not so nice people. There are various kinds of nice people, various kinds of not so nice people. There are, for example, nice people who belong to the country club set. There are nice people who belong to the arty set. Nice people who belong to the social service set, and so on. And then there are nasty people who may variously be defined as the poor, the beatniks, the generally disrespectable people who live on the wrong side of the track or the wrong part of the hill or whatever it is, or the wrong town. And but the nice people boost and maintain their collective ego by talking about how dreadful the nasty people are. And the nasty people boost their collective ego by talking about what frightful bourgeois squares the nice people are. But they don't, neither group realize it, that they have a symbiotic relationship, just like bees and flowers. Only, whereas the bee-flower relationship is harmonious, the symbiosis of differing social groups is disharmonious, because each group needs the other to know who it is. Because if you were the only kind of people there were, you wouldn't know who you were. See, in a totally conformist society, someone sitting next to you is just like you, so there's no point talking to him, because you might just as well talk to yourself. In other words, really and truly, to be yourself, you need other. You don't know what you mean by self unless you know what you mean by other. So this is how yang and yin, the polarities, generate everything. And are absolutely essential to each other. Now, the funny thing is this. If you belong to a certain group of saved or elected people, and you know you're saved and elect because of the damned people outside, whether this is a social salvation, a spiritual salvation, or any kind of salvation you want to think of, financial salvation, whatever. When you realize that you only know who you are because of the, as it were, adversary or enemy or outgroup, you start laughing. Because that's very funny. It's the contrast from suddenly thinking, wow, those bastards outside, and suddenly realizing that they are enabling you to take this pose of coming on tough, which you think is great. And you start laughing. And this is why society, as we now know it, is afraid of this ever getting let out. This is really subversive. This is terrible subversive stuff. I mean, all that Marxist is just the same thing as us, backwards. It's the collectivist idea of the state as opposed to the individualist idea of the state. But the individualists become collectivists through huge corporations. Lenin said he would love to see these great corporations growing up because it would be just so much easier for the state to take over. They'd already provided the organization. So you see, there is a tendency within our economy to become a collectivist economy, just by progressing with its own whatever it's doing, with its so-called free enterprise. And there will be naturally, therefore, be a tendency in a collective economy to fall apart because it all gets so boring, and start everybody out on his own initiative again. This thing goes round and round. But the important thing is that, supposing you believe in a free enterprise economy, you must have, in order to maintain your solidarity, especially in a very great country, you must have an external enemy. And if there wasn't one, you'd have to invent one. Because that keeps everybody on their toes, it keeps us from slacking on the job, and they say, you've got to beat those fellows. And they're terrible. So we've got to be very serious about that, see? And of course, you lose your sense of humor. When you get so serious, you don't really know underneath that it's a game. Then you become a bircher, on one extreme or a communist on the other. So you have to keep, if you want to be a sane human being, you have to know right in the back of your head, right back here, what the Germans call a Hintergedanke, which is way in the back of your mind. You have to see the point that enemies need each other. Cops and robbers. Where would the cops be for a job if there weren't any robbers? How would you know you were law-abiding if there weren't criminals? It's tricky, but it's very dangerous teaching. Very subversive, because you might think, I would say, if I realized that, well, I said, it simply doesn't matter what kind of a person I am. I can do anything I want, because evil is necessary to good. But there's no fun in that attitude, because that simply says I won't play. All right, if you want to sit by yourself under a tree and not play, I guess you could do that, provided you don't interfere with our game. And if you come and interfere with our game and say, well, now look here, you people, you're all wrong, because you think you ought to be good, but it doesn't matter whether you're good or not, see? You mustn't do that. Don't interfere with the game. In order to have this kind of knowledge, that's why all this kind of knowledge has always been esoteric. And in any esoteric school, people were tested first, before they got in order to find out whether you were civilized. In other words, you can't give powerful tools and powerful knowledge to people who aren't civilized, and who have no humor, and who have no graciousness. That's why it's difficult when young people get hold of knowledge for which they're not emotionally prepared. And they are given full and total instruction on birth control when they're 4 years old. It means nothing at all. Or it may mean something positively dangerous. But nowadays, there's no way of concealing these things. I said it's a secret, but in the world of science, there are no secrets. So I don't feel any compunction about talking about these things, because if I don't, somebody else is going to. Because an awful lot of people know about it. But that is the inside dope, if I may say so. That these extremes need each other and can't manifest without each other. And the point is how to keep your head when you know that. So let's have an intermission. Well, now, this morning I was dealing mainly with two key ideas, one of which was the physical universe as a system of intermeshing spectra, depending on each other and playing with each other in the same way as warp and woof in weaving. And I underlined the notion that these spectra are different dimensions rather than components of the physical world. And that, although I'm using the word physical here, I'm using it in the sense of its original meaning natural, rather than the later meaning that has been attached to it, that is to say, material world. The world envisaged by analogy with ceramics. The material world considered as a world made out of stuff. You see, as we all know, stuff is supposed to be something inert and stupid, which can't do anything. And therefore, in order that stuff may be found in intelligent shapes, it has to be informed by an external energy, an external intelligence, so as to be brought into shape. And this is the idea of the world based upon the analogy between creation and carpentry, or creation and ceramics, or creation and sculpture. Just in parentheses, good ceramists and sculptors don't treat their medium as if it was stupid. They know that the potter, who is a good potter, knows that there is life in clay, and that he has to respond to that life in order to do the work of pottery properly. But those who are not themselves artists don't know this, and therefore the public has been bamboozled for centuries on the notion that patterns have to be composed of some sort of basic stuff. Now I was trying to substitute for that sort of conception of the world the idea of interweaving spectra which are different dimensions of energy or of patterning. And I used advisedly the verb patterning as distinct from the noun pattern, because when you use nouns in combination with verbs, you obscure language. Watch out for this. This underlies many people's misunderstanding of things, is the differentiation of noun and verb. It's an entirely unnecessary differentiation. And it gives one the impression that wherever there is an action going on, that is to say, something appropriately described by a verb, there must be some other kind of thing than an action, which is described by a noun, and to this is ascribed the origin of the action. So when you say, there is thinking, because the verb has to have a subject, which is a noun, someone says, well, who is thinking? Obviously, there can't be any thinking without a thinker, without a who that thinks. And that is a question, a problem that arises simply because it is a convention of our grammar that every verb has to have a subject which must always be a noun. So a noun stands for a thing, and a verb stands for an event. And we therefore suppose that events are caused by things. But if you ask a person what he means by a thing, he will never be able to tell you. He will give you a series of synonyms, such as object, fact, whatever. But all these are simply alternate words for thing. Then what do you mean by an event? You say process, etc. And it's equally vague. You can always describe events in terms of things, and equally you can describe things in terms of events. If I want to say, ordinary, while the cat sat on the mat, the dog went for a walk around the house. That's noun-verb language. But I can equally say, while the catting sat on the matting, the dogging went walking around the dwelling. and I've changed the whole sentence into verbs, and it's still as clear as it was in the beginning. Or I can turn it all into nouns. The cat, seat upon the mat, the dog upon a walk around the house. It's all nouns. But in a noun world, of course, you'll have a static world. In a verb world, you'll have a dynamic world. But there aren't, for example, if you take the word fist, is a fist a noun? Yes. But it describes a process. It's not properly a noun, because this noun suddenly vanishes. This thing, fist called fist, disappears the minute I open my hand. What happened to it? See, I stopped fisting, and I went into handing. So the verb language has a little edge over the noun language as being better suited to the kind of process that nature is. So, when you realize that you can discuss the whole of nature in the verb language, you don't have to ask the question, who started it? You don't, in other words, have to seek for a noun as the explanation of the verbs. You don't have to seek for something that is not process to start process off. So, this then is the language I'm using when I talk about patterning as the basic goings-on of the physical world, and patterning can be described and measured and so on and so forth. So then, the other point that I was making particularly was in the spectrum, you have the extremes of the spectrum. The sound and the silence, the light and the dark, space and solid. And I was showing how by the yin-yang philosophy of the Chinese, how these extremes are not opposites but poles. They go together. They require each other. You know one in terms of the other. And so in this way, you don't have the world as an opposition of light and darkness, of being and non-being, in such a way that one of the poles could exist alone, either being or non-being, non-being or being. Because the whole nature of poles is that without both of them there are neither. And so if we have a polar universe, then you don't, as it were, have to worry, as if this was something to worry about, that the play, the music of existence might cease forever and ever and ever. In that kind of cosmology argument that's now going on, there are two dominant theories of cosmology among physicists. One is the steady-state theory, and the other is the explosion theory. The steady-state people want to make out that hydrogen, free hydrogen in space, is all the time, as it were, coagulating and forming itself into new bodies. Whereas the explosion theory people, who have the edge of the argument at the moment, say there was originally an enormous concentration of energy which blew up and expelled all the galaxies from it, which went floating out, and the whole thing is gradually dissipating itself radioactively until it will reach a state of quiescence. And of course, if you have a Judeo-Christian mind which thinks of time in a linear way instead of a circular way, you'll think that's awful, because the whole thing is running down, and when it's finished, that'll be it. But you see, I always want to ask the question, well, what was it like before the Big Bang went off in the beginning? Probably pretty much the same state of affairs as when it all petered out in the end. In other words, whatever happened once can always happen again, given enough time, or given enough something or other. So I'll settle for either the steady state theory or the Big Bang theory. It doesn't make much difference, except by way of describing the pattern, how it happens. The question of whether it happens, I always figure that whatever did happen could happen again. I like to think about myself. Well, I'm a kind of a funny phenomenon that this universe is doing. And it's done me this time. It may do me again later on, maybe a million years from now. It'll do me again, not quite the same way, but rather like me, near enough to be me. Like you play the piano, and you play a certain piece, and then you stop, and the piece is dead. Then you think, well, let's play it again. And you play the same piece again. It's the same piece, but it's a different playing. Play the tape recorder. I've got the tape on here. I can play it. Then it stops. Then several days later, we can put it on and play it again. It's a little different probably, but same process. And every time the universe plays any one of you, each one of you it plays is I. See, everybody calls himself I. And you feel like you're I just as much as I feel I'm I. That is to say that you're the middle, the sensitive center, out of which everything looks. And you call yourself I, well, that's my name. And everyone is I. The only trouble about being I is that you can only be one at a time. See, when a child asks, who would I have been if my father had been someone else? Mummy. Well, the funny questions children ask. Well, you had to be someone in order to be anyone. But every someone is I. And it's all, as it were, the same I, looking out through different eyes. You put an electric light inside a black sphere and make holes in the sphere, and all the holes are different, but the light at the bottom of it's the same. Something like that. That's a kind of a rough analogy. But anyone knows from a physical point of view that every organism is simply a pattern of behavior which can't be separated from the pattern of behavior which we call its environment. It's all one pattern, except the one pattern, like every one pattern. Give me a pattern, and every pattern, look at these bamboos. There's a pattern. And every pattern has wiggles in it, and sub-wiggles, and sub-sub-wiggles. See, the main wiggle is the stem. Then the twig come out as a sub-wiggle. The leaf comes out as a sub-sub-wiggle. And if you look into the leaf, there are sub-sub-sub-wiggles. And that's the way it goes. They all belong to the pattern. It's difficult, too, to say who's wiggling what. Is the stem wiggling the leaves, or are the leaves wiggling the stem? Both arguments are equally valid. The universe is doing me, and I'm doing the universe, because the universe depends on my optic nerves and all that structure to turn the sun into light. Wouldn't be light if there weren't any eyes. Just like a hand on a drum. If there's no skin on the drum, there will be no noise. It takes two. To make love, and to make an argument, to do anything. That's the yang and the yin. Well, now, let's go through this spectrum, or begin to go through it. I'm not going to go all the way through it this afternoon. We begin at the end of sleep, torpor, and we'll go as far as number 3. Do you know that sleep is a very mysterious subject? Scientific students of sleep are not yet at all sure what sleep is. Apparently people need it, but nobody really knows why they need it from a strictly scientific point of view. And we apparently need to dream in sleep also. People who are deprived of dreams get very, very restless and unhappy. But we're not quite sure why we need dreaming. I mean, we've got all sorts of theories, the Freudians and the Jungians and so on. They think they know why we need to dream. But it hasn't been really rigorously established scientifically why we do, or why we need to sleep. But from a naive point of view, you can say, of course I need to sleep. Because after I've had a whole day of business and friends and work and so on, it's too much. There's too much input. I want to digest it. And while I'm digesting it, I don't want any more input. I don't want any more information. So I want to be turned off. That's, one of those simple common sense things that everybody knows, but has not yet been fully explained. So sleep is this marvelous thing that we have, which is a forgettery process that is apparently essential to our psychic health every 12 hours or so. And if you don't get it, you start getting worried. As a matter of fact, insomnia is a thing that is rather curious. Because if you do get insomnia, the worst thing of all to do is to worry about it. Invariably, if I can't sleep, I don't try to go to sleep, I get up and work. Or do something. Or I read a very difficult book, especially one that is big and weighs a lot. This is a good way to go to sleep. But if you have insomnia, don't ever try to go to sleep. Nobody can try to go to sleep. Lots of mothers think they can get their children and they say, darling, try to go to sleep. Didn't your mother say to you, try to go to sleep? But she wanted to get you out of the way. That was the only reason she said, try to go to sleep. Or she thought perhaps it was good for you and that you ought really to get your sleep. It's like telling some child that it's got to eat its spinach. The child can start chewing and chewing and chewing on meat or spinach, which tastes of nothing, and it chews it into an absolute hard, stiff pulp, and there's just nothing to be done with it except spit it out. And, they've already extracted by their teeth instead of their stomach all the vital juices from the thing, and all that remains is roughage. And you say to children, you must go to the bathroom after breakfast. Every day, regularly. You must be regular. Otherwise you're constipated, and that's bad. This is a form of the double bind. You are required to do that which will be good only if it's done voluntarily. So try to go to sleep. It is impossible. Sleep has to happen because it's a spontaneous activity, and it can be helped, as we shall see when we come to consider torpor. But by and large, sleep is a spontaneous activity and is a way of turning yourself off to get away from the bombardment of awareness and forget, because forgetting renews. And that also is a function of all demolitions, of deaths, of destruction of patterns, of knocking down buildings, of the whole change process in the universe. Because we want to do what we've done before over again, only if you remember it too often, it'll become boring. So if you forget, then you can do it again, and it'll be just as amazing as it was the first time. And so there absolutely has to be a forgettery built into this universe in just the same way and for just the same reasons that there must be an eliminative process in the body as well as an eating process. And both are vitally important. And you see, we have very different attitudes to the two. Eating is something we do socially, eliminating is something we do privately. Eating we consider, we want the
all good smells and all that kind of thing, eliminating his all bad smells and that kind of thing. Well, this is largely social conditioning that tells us this. But nevertheless, these are the two sides of the game we play, and there's a spectrum between the two. So in the same way here, you have to forget, just as you have to eliminate, so that everything is renewed, because it can happen again without being boring. Things that happen all the time, in any way, begin to pass out of consciousness. For example, if there is a constant noise going on while we're talking, it will annoy us at first, but after a while we shall cease to notice it, if it's constant. But if it keeps varying and coming on in different volumes and different rhythms, it'll hold our attention all the time. So anything that just goes diggity-ding, 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 you eventually cease to notice. So then, sleep is the renewer, because it's the state of forgetfulness. I'm not going to go in this seminar into the whole problem of dreams. That would lead us very far afield. Now, torpor describes something approaching sleep. But this also is a valuable state, because it's very comfortable. One can, in sleep, you're not aware of sleeping. But in torpor, you are aware of the comfort of tiredness and minified consciousness. It is a sort of pseudo-return to the womb. And so when after a hard day's work, where people have been irritating and combative, you go home or you go to the local bar and you down a number of martinis, they turn you off, and they put you into a state of near torpor, or what is quite correctly and scientifically called, by this learned and funny word, narcosis. Narcosis, Narcissus, is connected with narcosis. It means torpor, reduced consciousness, reduced sensory input. And the reason why Narcissus is associated with narcosis is that Narcissus, when he saw his reflection in the water, didn't know it was himself. And he became so fascinated by this image in the water that he became unaware of everything else. He got hung up, or shall we say, to use current slang, hooked on his own image. And he didn't know it was his own image. That was the only reason he could get hooked on it. So Narcissus and narcosis are associated. And so the permissive narcotic in our culture is alcohol. And other narcotics like opiates exist. But you must remember that you can only correctly use the word narcotic of something inducing the state of consciousness which is torpor. Now you can do it by massage, by relaxation exercises, by hot tubs, many, many ways of inducing torpor. You're not in torpor, you're not truly relaxed, because you tend to lose muscular tonus, which you always retain in true relaxation. But you begin to go like a limp rag. Now there's a place for that in life. And it's good as a way of sleep induction for people who have insomnia and are so anxious that they don't allow themselves to be turned off. I would want to say in general a good word for sleep and torpor, because a lot of people are against them. Uspensky, who was Gurdjieff's sort of St. Paul, and as much as a misinterpreter in a way too, always felt that his life was a war against sleep. that intense light consciousness should conquer darkness. Now that's a stupid idea. To be a human being, you have to love the light, but you also must trust yourself to the darkness. Be able to let yourself go in the faith that you'll arrive back all in one piece. I have a friend who her name is Charlotte Selver, and she does a kind of work for which there is no name. She calls it sensory awareness. And one of her experiments is to get a person to lie on the ground, and simply she says to them, now, it's all right, the ground is going to hold you up. So just lie down, and there's nothing else you need to do, because the ground is firm and it will hold you there. Then she examines the person's body after a while and says, look, do you know what you're doing? You're trying to hold yourself together, as if your skin weren't strong enough to contain you. And you're doing this all the time to keep yourself from falling apart. Why? You think, do you, that if you don't hold yourself together, you're just going to go blah and disappear into some kind of frightful green jello? No, you won't. In the same way, a lot of people, it's why we wear such ridiculous clothes, especially women. Men are pretty bad, but women, the men do it around the neck. You know, that necktie, a symbol of slavery. It's a noose to strangle you with. But you feel tight. They're really held in here, and held in by the belt, and women wear girdles that hold them in like this, and in the coat that fits your body, jacket, you know, you put it on, and it fits, and you're squeezed, or you get these tight pants that hug you, and you know you're there. Other people, of course, don't know they're there till they're sitting on spikes. Then they really know they're there. And a lot of people make trouble for themselves in order to be able to sit on spikes, so that they know they're there. Now, supposing instead you switch to another kind of clothes, you wear Japanese clothes. I often wear Japanese clothes because they happen to be, for men, the most comfortable form of clothing ever devised. There's only one place where it holds you, and that's at the belt. But you wear the belt not round your waist, but below your belly. And you wear it rather loose. Otherwise, the garments are flowing. They don't interfere with the nature of the cloth, because the cloth is woven on a rectilinear pattern. See, cloth is straight like this. So when you get a Japanese kimono, it folds up instantly for packing. But you try to pack a Western man's jacket or a woman's suit jacket, and there's absolutely no way of folding the thing at all. So it always comes out of your suitcase needing to go to the pressing. But you take a kimono and you put it on, and it falls exactly according to its own nature around you, and they're very dignified. And you feel, but you don't feel closed in. Now that makes some people terribly uncomfortable. If they don't feel pinched and pulled together, they don't feel dressed. And feel this is, I'm going around in the bathrobe. And a lot of people can't wear a bathrobe beyond a certain hour of the day because they don't feel that they're respectable. I mean, you can perfectly well get up and put yourself into the most beautiful, any kind of gorgeous bathrobe you want to, and run around and do your work if you don't have to go to the office. Even if you had to go to the office, they ought to allow you to wear interesting robes. And furthermore, I once asked a Japanese why he didn't wear a kimono anymore. And he said, you can't run for a bus in a kimono. Well, it's perfectly true. Unless you hoist it up and tie it into the belt, you can't. And that's rather undignified. But the thing is that in this age that is now forthcoming, when we're going to cut down the working hours because of automation, people have got to learn to saunter and dawdle. Otherwise they'll get into mischief. And so forms of clothing which are supremely comfortable, which require a kind of a sauntering attitude to life, are going to be very important for the future of civilization. This pitch for the kimono. Now, but this is all to do with letting yourself go into the earth, into the darkness, as it were, and trusting the world that lies below you as much as you might trust the world that lies above you. Drop. Fall freely in space. That's a marvelous sensation. It's like floating. That's why people do skydiving. Because just until they pull that parachute, they have the sensation of flying. Even though they're dropping very fast, they get the sensation. Total freedom. Whee! See? That's what everybody's looking for. So we get that in a way in sleep. The arms of Morpheus. And the idea of sleep as healing. Some psychiatrists are very keen on the idea of putting their patients by hypnosis and other methods into long, long periods of sleep where they feel completely secure and looked after, nothing to worry about. I have a favorite sleeping place. It's a house on top of the hills in Hollywood where there's a great eucalyptus tree, and underneath this there is a deck. And I like to get a sleeping bag and lie on my back underneath this eucalyptus tree and look up at the stars through the shadows of the leaves and just go. See, it is a marvelous feeling. Well, now we come now to the things of sleep, where I will say this one thing about dreaming and about torpor. We know the motto, in vino veritas. In wine the truth comes out. Of course, it also has a subtle double-take meaning. All popular sayings have many levels of meaning. And it's a Christian saying, in vino veritas, belongs to the Western culture. It also means in the wine is the true blood of Christ, the Catholic Mass. And that refers to the fact that life requires death, the drinking of blood. But in the sense of in vino veritas, a person reveals himself, lets go of himself, lets his unconscious come out when he is drunk, or also in sleep when the dreams come up and show the inner side of things. You will see in that way that these two states can in a certain sense be creative. They let things come up which are normally put down. Because number 3 spectrum, the waking state of what we will call symbolic consciousness, is highly guarded. It is the most guarded of all these states. Now then, I want you to understand then that the ordinary state of consciousness, what you call normal consciousness, is by no means a frank, objective awareness of the real world. Not by any means at all. It is a state of highly cultivated, hothouse-reared, special ways of perceiving the world, in accordance with symbolic formulae. And it all depends on your orientation to the physical world as to what you see in it. You know the story of the tailor who went to see the Pope? And they asked him, what was he like? And he said he was a 41. Or a woman who says to a man, you saw Mrs. So-and-so today? Yeah. What was she wearing? She had no idea. You didn't notice, but you saw. but you didn't pay attention because you weren't interested in what she had on, but what she had off, or whatever it be. So we notice according to what we are programmed or conditioned to notice by our social conditioning, that is to say, our upbringing, our education, our professional needs, our survival needs. So do we notice what's happening. Now, supposing somebody from an entirely different planet came into this room and started looking at us, and he wasn't programmed to notice the things that we notice, he would ask the most amazing questions about what we're doing. He had noticed that most of us have standard ways of holding our hands. Why do some of you sit like this? Why do some of you sit like this? Why do some of you sit like this? Why don't you do this? Wouldn't that be an obvious thing to do with your hands? Just let them hang. No, very few people ever do that. Because they feel, a funny feeling they get, that they got a couple of wet fish down here. They don't know what to do with. See? And then he noticed all sorts of funny things about us that we would never occur to us to think about. And he would notice, for example, you might say, well, what color is a human face? You know, the comic strip artists tell you. Pink or brown. They do a black outline and then they color the whole face pink. Now, for a change, take a real good look at a face. And you'll start seeing that it just doesn't have a particular color. Not only does it depend where the face is in relation to the available light and what it's reflecting, but also it's a patchwork of all kinds of subtle color changes, and is full of funny hairs and spots and all sorts of things, which we're not supposed to see, especially on ladies. You know, men don't care so much if they have a hair somewhere, but girls carefully pluck hairs out with tweezers and make them disappear so as to get as smooth a texture as possible. The Japanese go so far as for a beauty to cover herself completely with a white paste so that she's got complete pancake makeup, dead white. And when a Japanese photographer takes a picture of you, you'll never recognize yourself because he works out every wrinkle, every shadow, and presents you as a complete mask. Because it's inauspicious to have shadows. When a Westerner first painted one of the emperors with the shadows showing, they said, but you can't paint the emperor that way. His face is not dirty. And besides, it's inauspicious to have a shadow fall on the imperial visage. So, you can see shadows. The artist, Rembrandt, taught you to see shadows. Leonardo taught you to see shadows. But modern painters have discovered that shadows aren't darkness. Shadows are light. Shadows are color. Shadows are full of vitality. So you begin to get vivid purple shadows. People say, well, but you don't go around with a purple shadow on you, do you? What do you mean? Do you? You think that a shadow is brown because you haven't ever looked at a shadow. And you don't realize that shadows are absolutely vibrant with light. We'll go more into that later when we come to this number 7. But there it is, you see, the world that we see or think we see is actually not the world at all, but is a selection of things that are in the world, a selection governed by certain symbolic processes. What a man ought to look like, what a woman ought to look like. And we try ourselves to dress and to behave in such a way as we live up to the symbolic requirements that are expected of us. So then, we think there's a certain kind of work that is worthy of being done. And you ought to be tinker, tailor, soldier, sailor, doctor, lawyer, merchant, chief, or whatever it is. And you ought to fit into one of these roles. Of course, there are innumerable things one might do. Infinite. But we like to get classified. We want to know whether you're a Republican or whether you're a Democrat. Whether you belong to the left wing or to the right wing. Whether you are a Christian, a Jew, Baptist, Methodist, whether you're a Mohammedan or what you are, just so long as we can get you put into a compartment. That is to say, into a symbolic classification. Now, what is the reason for that? Well, this kind of consciousness here is based on a very peculiar specialization of the human brain, which we call, in everyday life, conscious attention. That is the capacity to focus or concentrate awareness upon what we call any one thing at a time. It's as if, in other words, conscious attention were a spotlight, and that the rest of awareness were a floodlight. In other words, every nerve end in your body is receiving input all the time, is in that sense energized, is aware of everything that comes to into its periphery. So you are taking in the totality of your surroundings. But conscious attention is flipping from point to point to point to point to point like this, and is making sense out of what it sees by adding it up with memory. It's an immense advantage from some points of view to be able to have this faculty, because it does the same sort of thing for the human organism that radar does for a ship. That is to say, the function of radar is to scan the surroundings of the ship and watch out for unexpected changes in the environment. And radar is a scanning process. In other words, it is a beam that goes out and bounces against things and feeds back the bounce to the screen. So in exactly the same way, consciousness or conscious attention is always scanning the environment and watching out for new eventualities that might be threatening or that might present favorable opportunities for some sort of advancement. Now, conscious attention has to be programmed as to what to attend to, what is important to look out for, so that we say to baby, now when we're teaching it language, watch out for the cars on the street, watch out for that dog, watch out for this, watch out for that. This is programming the baby's radar. But we, as a human community, have put so much importance and so much psychic investment into our radar that we believe ourselves to be that. We identify the self with the radar and not with the rest. So that we get this sort of a situation. When I say I say I do this, I walk, I talk, I think, I run, I hit. But other things, such as the beating of the heart, the breathing of the lungs, the functioning of the glands, the constellation of the shapes of the bones, are all defined not as anything I do, but as something that happens to me. Just in the same way, when it rains, it happens to me. I don't rain. But I do walk. And so, in other words, what has happened here is that we have identified ourselves with the point of origination of conscious attention and with the point of voluntary control. That's me. Anything else happens to me. So in this way, we have disowned most of ourselves. It's not me. The body you have is merely a vehicle that you go around in like an automobile. So if I would say to some young woman, "Gee, you're beautiful," she might well reply, if she were highly influenced by our culture, "Oh, you're so like a man. All you think about is bodies. I may be beautiful, but I got my body from my parents. And I want to be admired for myself and not for my chassis." See, she's a poor little chauffeur. That's how she defines herself. She disowned herself. She disowned her body and said, "It was given to me by my parents. I'm not responsible for it." Or a child in rage can say to its parents, "I never asked to be born. It was you who brought me into this world." And that child doesn't know that when the father was going after the mama and there was just an evil gleam in his eye, that evil gleam in your father's eye was you. Just as it was you, that was the little spermatozoon that made it. It was you that was that fetus. Just as if your heart is you, all that was you too. But you see, this waking consciousness, symbolic consciousness, ignores that altogether. Because it sets limits, and rather arbitrary limits, to what you are. You are just that voluntary center. You are that beam of consciousness that sweeps over the environment and sees things in series, one after another. Especially if you use a language which uses an alphabet. Alphabets spell everything out one after another. And you see, in other words, these sort of words strung together into sentences which build up meanings. Whereas on the other hand, if you work in terms of an ideographic language, although it's true that an ideograph has parts like words do, the parts of a word always follow each other in this direction. Whereas the parts of an ideograph may go in an entirely different direction. See? This which is the Tao in Chinese. I take it in all at once. I need a sentence to translate that word in English. But it's more of a picture than it is like ordinary words. And as you grasp all the elements of the picture simultaneously, you see the form altogether at once. That is nearer to the way nature exists. Nature, things in nature exist altogether at once. Everything's happening altogether everywhere all at once. You know? And we say, well, in words, it won't stop for you to describe it. Take too long. By the time you've described it, it's all different. So, we do, you see, luckily for us, have an aspect of our organism which is paying attention to all the things we don't notice. This is how you can walk without stumbling. how you can drive a car downtown and at the same time carry on a conversation with a friend. Because it is your subconscious, as it were, or whatever you call it, that is taking care of the driving and is watching out for the red and green lights and for the other cars, while your consciousness is preoccupied with the conversation. So, however, in a culture where the value of spotlight consciousness is exalted, and that is you, then do you see you have an exceedingly great need for state number 2, for torpor. Because the spotlight is so bright, and you can have too much of it so fast. And also, if you identify yourself with that only, you identify yourself with the troubleshooting aspect of your organism, and you become relatively unaware of the amazingly harmonious and happy states of your organism that are going on all the time. And in times you see certain kinds of culture, certain epochs in history, people emphasize that you've always got to be on the watch. And they regard it as very sinful to relax into the beautiful, wonderful processes that are going on in us that are harmonious constantly. See, to enjoy breathing. That's a silly thing to do. Most people would say, well, enjoy breathing? What's that going to achieve? And this is all goes back, you see, to this Christian idea. Brethren, be sober, be vigilant. For your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. Whom resists steadfast in the faith. You know the hymn, Christian, dost thou see them on this holy ground? How the powers of darkness prowl and prowl around. Christian, up and fight them, you know. And wowee, it's going on all the time. See, you're never safe. Just as there are termites in the basement, gnawing away. Parasites in your blood. Probably few little cancer cells kicking up somewhere. Go to the doctor, inspect, check up. Once every 2 months, watch, it's coming, see? It's coming. And you've got to correct it here, correct it there, keep everything going. Otherwise the weeds keep coming in. If you don't watch out, the birds are all over the roof. Birds, you know, keep watching human beings. And the minute the birds got any idea that a house is really vacant, they're going to move in. Squirrels, rats, everybody is waiting. And so on the spiritual level, there are the demons. They're just waiting, watching for you. So stay awake. Don't dare go to sleep. Don't ever relax. Because if you do, in it will come. Watch therefore and pray. You never know when it's going to happen. So this is the complete identification of man with his troubleshooter, which has got to be on the watch. Now, the only difficulty about this is that when you manage to protect yourself so successfully against all the powers of darkness, you reach a point where you become the kind of creature that's no longer worth protecting. It's the same sort of thing that happens, that if to defeat the Nazis you have to become Nazis, what was the point of the fight? If to defeat the Gestapo and the Secret Service of the Red Chinese and all that plot, we have to have a secret police ourselves, who are going to be just as bad as theirs, what is gained? What are you protecting? See? The biggest farce of all is this, that if you want to know the real lowdown on the next war, join the Air Force and be safe. Because the only people who are really going to be protected are the guards. You know, you'll be able to have either be way up there, or else you'll be in great, vast basements in Nevada, where they've built under-mountain airports with all sorts of oxygen tanks and supplies and things that last forever, because what a farce the whole thing has become. The original idea of guards and soldiers was to protect the women and the children. Now what we do is we have the women and children bombed out of existence in the cities, whereas the guards are guarded. So all guarding eventually becomes guarding of guards. It's circles of defense protecting circles of defense. And in this way, mammals turn into mollusks. A mammal is so constructed, you see, that the hard stuff is on the inside and the soft stuff on the outside. A mollusk is the other way around, with the hard stuff on the outside and the soft stuff on the inside. Well, nature favors a bit mammals over mollusks, because a mammal is more sensitive, more responsive. See, a mollusk, you go donk on it and it doesn't feel anything. Whereas the mammal is really pliable, which is why, of course, in military tactics we abandoned armor. A knight in armor was completely helpless once he was unhorsed. Because he wore this armor, but he depended upon the forward rush of the horse and his lance to just blow through everything. But once you managed to unhorse him, he was the clumsiest thing. He was like a lobster. And all you had to do was to knock him down and crack open his shell with a can opener. So, increased mobility was found to be more effective. So now, this watch business. Watch, guard, always be watching, see? As I say, it creates, it protects, it encourages a style of life which eventually is not worth living, because it is like being the great dictator. It is like trying to be God. If you're the great dictator, and you're in charge of everything, you should read a Hindu book called the Arthashastra. This deals with advice to a man who is a Chakravartin, that means a turner of the wheel, or we would say a big wheel, who is the supreme ruler. And it tells him, first of all, that he mustn't trust anyone. No friends for you, my boy. No intimacies. Keep your own counsel. And especially, watch out for women. They have a way of worming secrets out of you for their favors which you want so much. So don't ever get too close to a woman. You can have concubines and prostitutes and everything like that to satisfy your physical needs. But don't fall in love. And trust no one. Then arrange it so that everybody around you mistrusts everyone else. You have set up what's called a kind of negative mandala. A mandala is a circle of power. You so arrange it that your immediate ministers are at odds with their subordinates. Why? Because if your immediate ministers do anything to betray you, their subordinates who want to occupy the superior position will sneak on them to you. Then you knock off the Grand Vizier and put someone in his place, because he's fool enough to want to get up there, but still. Then outside that rank you have another rank of people at odds with those, and so all the way down. Divide and rule. Then you live at the center yourself, and you have a secret passage connecting your inmost center with somewhere down the river where you've got a boat waiting in case anything goes wrong. And on the way out there's a stone which you can remove. And when you remove this key stone as you escape through your underground passage, the entire palace will collapse and kill everyone in it. It gives you architectural instructions how to do this. Then, of course, you have to have poison testers for your food. Eat nothing until someone else has eaten it and see if they drop dead. And then you have to have guards standing beside you, always, day and night. But there are other guards secreted behind panels in the wall who are watching the guards guarding you. And so you can't really ever sleep except with one eye open. You can never be like an ordinary inconspicuous individual and take a carefree walk in the park, because you have got to be in control 24 hours a day. So do you see how Big Brother, this is a Hindu version of Big Brother, is the greatest prisoner of all? He is the captive of his own survival system. He can never go this way. We find it very difficult, too, to go this way. He has to be all the time playing God, playing the personal, autocratic monarch of the universe. Now, you may think this very courageous, and so on, but in the end, the game isn't worth the candle. It has to fall apart. So always watch it, that what you fight for is worth fighting for, and that it's something other than fighting for fighting for. Because otherwise you start fighting for fighting for fighting for, fighting for fighting for fighting for. So these then, in sum, are the advantages and limits of waking consciousness. That it is a version of the world where what is important is what is valuable for survival, where we live for a future, where we live always watchful for trouble, because death is the thing most of all to be avoided. But this is a form of life which is always in danger of becoming not worth living, and which totally ignores a whole world of experience going on all the time around us, which is magical, gorgeous, and far surpassing in depth and wonder most of the things which ordinary waking consciousness people call pleasures. Yesterday afternoon I was working mainly on the contrast between the normal state of waking conscious attention, which was this one, number 3, and what you might call the generalized awareness of the human organism. And I was using the metaphor of conscious attention as a spotlight and the generalized awareness of the organism as a floodlight, and showing how, by identifying ourselves with the spotlight operation of consciousness and with the voluntary neuromuscular system, we attain to a very partial conception of ourselves and a very partial and symbolic view of the world. That is to say, we see what we learn to notice, and we screen out everything else. We really don't notice anything that we don't also have a name for. And children are constantly asking when they're learning to talk, what is this and what is that? And you'll notice that children very often point to things for which we don't have any names, and they want to know what it is. For example, we don't, like some of the American Indians, have a name for dry space. Nor do we have a name for the inside surface of a cylinder. There may be a mathematical term for it, but in ordinary speech, the inside surface of a cylinder doesn't have a name for it. except a long phrase, the inside surface of a cylinder. Nor, for example, do we see any connection between having 6 toes and pushing aside the branches of a bush to get through. But in an American Indian language, those are the same ideas. It's all based on the idea of V. You V the branches to get through, and you, as to your foot, you have a 6th one Ving off at the edge. You see, now, what you notice, the way the world seems to you, the way its logical connections seem to you depend on whether you have words for it or whether you have symbols for it. So then, what happens is, as a result of concentrating on, or of using, shall I say, overusing, over-exercising the faculty for conscious attention, we come to have a sensation of our own existence as beings definitively separate from the outside world, the world beyond the skin, and from most of what goes on in our own bodies. And this state of affairs we could call alienation. When this state of affairs exists all by itself, but it is not necessary for that state of affairs to exist all by itself. The spotlight consciousness can be supplemented by increasing use of the floodlight consciousness so that it becomes balanced. We assume that the baby, before it has learned conscious attention and before it has learned any words, is all the time using floodlight consciousness with a little bit of spotlight, and therefore would feel, as Freud supposed, oceanic, that is to say, at one with its surroundings. When later words are used and it is taught to be itself and to construct the outside world as society constructs it and conceives it, then the baby develops a sense of having a separate ego. And this development is brought about by means of a stratagem, which gives the infant a great deal of confusion. Because since the baby is given a sense of identity by parents and teachers and relatives and other children, it is unable to resist the pressure put upon it by the social group. The pressure of a group, even upon an adult, is enormously powerful. Much more so on a child. So the odd thing is that by the commanding pressure of this group, the child is informed that it is free. That is to say, that it is an independent agent and an originator of actions for which this separate identity is to be held responsible. And in that, you see, there is a weird gimmick, because the baby is told that it must be free. You are ordered to be free. That is to say, you are required to do actions which will be acceptable only if you do them voluntarily. And this basic contradiction that underlies our sensation of personal existence is the result why most people are confused, and why there is a nagging sense of frustration underlying all civilized human existence, because you are trying to solve a self-contradictory and therefore insoluble problem: how to be responsible. You see, the word responsible carries its own contradiction. It carries freedom. You are able freely to decide upon your own actions, but you must be responsible. You must do what you're told. So that paradox creates then the sense of the separate ego, which is, if anything, is a hallucination, because it doesn't correspond to any kind of scientific facts whatsoever. The separate organism, although separate, although having a clear outline and identity in that sense, and although every human character is unique and different from all others,